I first got interested, it was about 1977, when a public relations consultant for a big asbestos company wanted a copy of an interview where I couldn't work out why they wanted this, because the only thing that was said was the asbestos industry is no longer unsafe, it's cleaned up its act. And I got really suspicious. I was only a young science reporter, knew nothing about asbestos really, other than the normal stuff that everybody knew, that, you know, it saved lives because of its wonderful fireproof qualities. And of course then I went on to find out that it wasn't saving lives, it was taking them. I started asking around, and in those days before the internet, you'd come across people, mainly trade union activists or workers, who would have a little pile of press cuttings. And they were press cuttings from the United States. Professor Irving Selikoff of Mount Sinai University in New York says this, or other stories, just little snippets. And they all had their own stories. These workers were mainly from the power stations in Australia, where there was a lot of asbestos lagging around the turbines and the pipes, and there were a lot of people starting to die. Australia only recently banned asbestos, believe it or not. Only in 2006 was it finally banned. But in effect, there was a sort of de facto ban, I suppose you could say, because of the litigation. It's a bit the same in the United States, although people are still importing it here and still using it. The ban in Australia came into force recently, but there was a sort of a ban implemented by the waterside workers who refused to have it imported. But the industry got around that by, instead of calling it asbestos, calling it chrysotile, shipping it in through the port of Newcastle and off to some brake lining manufacturers. So that was still going on until very recently. That lesson, of course, has been repeated on a much bigger scale, where the entire industry now prefers to call itself chrysotile, not asbestos. Well, I'd heard about India from a lot of people for a long time, and it was alarming me that the industry there was growing just about as rapidly as the Indian economy was growing. It and China are the two big growth areas for the asbestos industry, and it really surprises people to learn that asbestos is a growth industry still in the 21st century. The problem is getting bigger and there are more people being exposed. So when the opportunity came to go to India, I grabbed it because I was both very interested and alarmed about what might be going on. And of course it was going on, and it was alarming. I think probably without doubt in India the biggest problem eventually is going to be in the just widespread use of asbestos cement as a building product. It's true that sometimes the conditions in the larger factories are better than the unregulated ones, but they'd want to be. The unregulated ones, you have people just handling asbestos by the sackful, sort of lifting it up and with no protection at all. But even in the larger factories, it's clear that they still have problems, and it's certainly clear that the industry tells lies. It says that chrysotile doesn't cause cancer, and you know, even members of the industry in Australia and elsewhere in the world have admitted that for some 50 or more years. So that's going to be a problem, and I think it's going to be a huge problem down the track when all this asbestos cement sheeting starts breaking up, and there's just so much of it, and there's more and more every year. I would say in the early days, I remember once going to a chrysotile mine in Australia, and I was interviewing the CEO of the company in the mill where they crushed the asbestos, and out of the corner of my eye I could see these workers sweeping up the asbestos that was like that thick on the floor and shoveling it into a bag, trying to clean it up before we got there. And I was trying to hold my breath and interview this guy at the same time, which is a rather difficult thing to do, let me tell you. So I remember worrying about it then, And I've got to say I'm sort of not that keen to go hanging out in asbestos areas quite so much anymore, because there is a sort of a rule that the more you're exposed, the more likely it is that you're going to get sick. I don't really think that I've been exposed to any sort of really dangerous situations, but you never know. And certainly I've sort of been in situations where I could have breathed crucidolite, for example, from Wittenoom, and that's a bit of a worry. I think the biggest problem we have now is that everybody thinks it's no longer a problem. Even in developed countries like the United States and in Australia and Europe, there's a lot of asbestos present in the built environment, and particularly home renovators, people like that, are constantly being exposed to it still. And that's going to go on for some time. It's still not at the situation where you can honestly say that there are people who are growing up as children now that won't necessarily get these asbestos diseases by the time they're 40 or 50. So that's a problem. And then the developing world, well, it's increasing exponentially. So there's a really big problem there still. I think the Italian trial is a big precedent, and already I think there's been people quite interested in it in Australia, in other parts of the world, where they've realised that these people do have faces and names, and they are people that knew what they were doing. The more people are exposed to the real story about asbestos, the angrier they're going to get. Up until now, it's still, relatively speaking, been restricted to people who've contracted disease or their friends or associates in the trade unions. But as the disease is spreading into the wider community with environmental exposure and exposure from home renovations and that kind of thing, there's much more awareness now of the impact of asbestos. But what there hasn't been is the awareness of just the cold-blooded, ruthless cover-up that took place, and the fact that a couple of senior executives, not even executives, but directors and owners of the companies responsible, have been sentenced and found guilty, criminally guilty, I think is a great precedent, and will actually make a lot of other people think in other countries. I certainly did follow the Libby trial, and of course there were high expectations there that there would be a successful criminal prosecution. It all seemed to fall in a heap in the end. There's a terrible story there, really, of corporate irresponsibility, and the plight of the people at Libby is a horrendous story and situation. It just never ceases to amaze me how sometimes these people get away with it. Well, I think they investigated the idea of charging them with criminal offences, and the prosecutor decided they wouldn't succeed. A similar situation occurred in Australia, where the directors and executives of James Hardie, the Australian asbestos manufacturer, were charged, but the prosecutor decided that a criminal charge would be difficult to prove because of the burden of proof, and so they switched to a civil trial, and they were found guilty. That's been appealed. The guilty verdict was overturned, and that's now being appealed again by the prosecutor. So we've yet to see. But I mean, the irony in the Australian situation was that the only thing these people have been charged with was, in effect, putting out a false press release, which, when you think about it, how many times have you seen a false press release? Admittedly, it was a press release saying, we have fully funded a compensation foundation to pay asbestos victims, when in fact the fund was more than $1 billion short. But still, nobody's ever been prosecuted for deliberately and knowingly exposing people to a substance they knew would kill. Well, the book, it seemed like a good idea at the time, but I warn anybody that wants to write a book, don't do it. Because I thought it would be a quick project. I knew the things I wanted to say, wrote out a list of chapter headings. Funnily enough, at the end of the day, the book came out pretty much the way those initial chapter summaries read, but there was a lot of work in between. There was 30 years of case law and thousands of documents that I waded through. The reason why I wanted to write it was because I had the knowledge from 30 years before, when I'd been a young science journalist and James Hardie was in its prime. It was the peak of asbestos production, and I sort of did a series of stories which really, I'm not saying got James Hardie out of asbestos, but very soon after that the media was sort of exposing the story much more, and Hardie moved out of asbestos, and I thought that would be pretty much the end of the story. And then of course 30 years later they were up to their old tricks again, moving offshore, leaving behind this massively underfunded foundation, leaving asbestos victims stranded and potentially without any compensation funds. And so I just thought, well, I'll have to write this story because people don't believe it really, and when you tell them they don't understand. And in particular, I was concerned that some of the people responsible, the owners of the company, should be mentioned too, because they always seem to get away with it. The book was well received. I thought it'd be a top bestseller, as every author does, and was pretty crestfallen to discover that it was only selling by the hundreds, not the thousands. But it sold out its first edition, and the good thing about the book is that it's being made into a television miniseries, and so there'll be another edition put out, but the dramatic version will, I think, reach a lot more people, and that's very satisfying, because at the end of the day it's the message that matters. Soon after the book came out, Fremantle Media approached me. I'd been wanting to make a documentary about the James Hardie story and the wider global story, but I found it was quite difficult to get international interest in doing something like that, although I think the audience would be interested in a story like that if it was done properly. But Fremantle wanted to do a drama, and so I was more than happy to embrace them and say, yes, let's do it. It wasn't as simple as that though. It took them years really before they were able to get the ABC, which is the place I work for, to commission the series, and it's being filmed as we're doing this interview, so should be going to air later this year. Well, the first thing that we need really is a cure for mesothelioma, or certainly better treatment for it. We need to see a situation where we can honestly say that people aren't going to be exposed to asbestos in lethal quantities anymore. They'd be the two major objectives, and after that I wouldn't mind seeing some of the people responsible at least publicly named and shamed, if not brought to justice. I think a lot of the time they do believe their own propaganda, and I interviewed an executive from James Hardie who, there was this great moment that he recounted where he was looking around the factory, where he said to me, he said, I was looking around and I thought, it can't do that, but what if it does? What if it's really true? And there was this sort of realisation. Now, I can understand that. You look around a factory and everybody's covered in the dust, and you know, somebody tells you, look, that dust's like cyanide, it'll kill you with the slightest sniff. Well, it's hard to believe that. It's really just an impossible stretch of the imagination. And a lot of these people that are working in the factories, particularly the workers, you know, they hear about asbestos out there, but that's not chrysotile in here. That's the kind of differentiation they make, and I think even the executives of the company start to believe it. The big problem with asbestos diseases is the long time, the long latency period between when you first inhale or ingest the fibres and the time that it takes for the disease to develop. And if there was a direct cause and effect, you know, you're exposed to asbestos and the next day you're dead, then people would believe it a lot quicker. I think any government that allows asbestos still to be used is criminally responsible too, frankly. I don't see any differentiation anymore between them and the industry that originally seduced the governments. There is no excuse, really, for any government to allow this. And apart from the cost in human lives and suffering, it's also financially irresponsible, because what they're doing is placing a burden on the state in terms of the health care and the clean-up costs later. Asbestos has no use today. It's used because it's there, and it's used because a few rich people want to get richer by mining the stuff that they're already mining. There's no other reason to use it other than vested financial interests. There are plenty of safe substitutes. You don't need asbestos to make cheap roofing, cheap pipes. You don't need asbestos for insulation. You never really have needed it, but certainly these days there are cheap, effective alternatives. The only reason why it continues to be used is to make some people with no morality or conscience richer. Well, I've got to say the ADAO conference was really fascinating for the people that were here. I've met some incredibly brave people. In my time I have met a number of people with mesothelioma and made friends with them, and got involved in some of their struggles. But I've got to say, it never ceases to amaze me when I meet some of these people that I've met here this time, for example, just how brave they are and how strong they are. I think that's the overwhelming memory that I'll have from this conference. I can see a tremendous role that Linda and the ADAO have developed of networking through the social media, and I know that it's been a deliberate strategy of the ADAO, and it's obviously one that's working because people can relate very personally through Facebook and through some of those media to share stories and experiences without necessarily living in the same town. So it has created this virtual community of asbestos disease sufferers and their families and supporters, and I think that's been probably extremely useful for them and also for the broader movement. Well, there was a lot of strength. I think it is going from strength to strength. It's never a big breakthrough with these things. It's always a sort of build up slowly, but I have a feeling that the asbestos movement internationally is starting to coalesce, and I think one of these days the industry is probably going to fall over. I certainly hope so. The problem is that the countries where asbestos is biggest, in places like Russia and Kazakhstan and China, I'm not sure how connected they are to this, but hopefully if their markets dry up, then the movement will succeed, notwithstanding that.